A man stood knee-deep in murky basement water, soaked to the skin, holding a wriggling frog in one hand and a soggy HOA fine in the other. The room smelled of mildew, soaked wood, and humiliation. Karen Stapleton, dressed in designer pajamas that clung to her like shrink wrap, looked at him in horror as he calmly said, "Ma'am, this is your doing." The frog croaked in agreement. Just 12 hours earlier, Karen had been sipping cucumber water on her porch, gloating over a brand-new gravel-filled patch where my drainage ditch used to be. Flashback begins. It all started innocently enough. I was cleaning out the leaves from the small drainage ditch behind my house, the same one I'd maintained for years since I bought the property. It wasn't fancy or landscaped, but it worked. Every summer, it funneled runoff from my yard, and from Karen's slightly elevated property, safely into the city's stormwater system. Without it, nature had a nasty habit of flooding the lowest spot around. That spot just so happened to be Karen's walkout basement. She either forgot that or thought gravity followed HOA bylaws. When Karen got herself elected president of the Homeowners Association, it was like watching a theater usher suddenly try to direct the whole show. She wasn't content enforcing rules, she wanted to create them. She started with mailbox heights, then lawn gnome removals, and finally found her crown jewel project, the beautification of easements. Her voice oozed with syrupy condescension as she explained to the HOA board how unsightly natural ditches were. She wanted them gone, filled in, covered, disguised as nature trails or rock gardens. I nearly choked on my coffee when I read her proposal in the monthly newsletter. It even came with a diagram showing a gravel-filled trench in place of my functioning ditch, complete with little ornamental shrubs and a cartoon sun smiling over it all. I thought surely no one would be foolish enough to approve it. I was wrong. Within 2 weeks, Karen had hired a crew that looked more like a team of party decorators than landscapers. They came in with wheelbarrows, bright yellow gloves, and a cement mixer. My ditch was declared a nuisance by the HOA. Karen marched down to my property in yoga pants and a clipboard, smugly informing me that the drainage channel was, quote, not up to neighborhood aesthetic standards. I told her it wasn't a backyard feature, it was a vital piece of functional hydrology. She replied with a chuckle and a wink, "Well, maybe you should install a pool instead. At least that's useful." That same day, they blocked the ditch with plywood, dumped in gravel, and planted 2 tiny trees beside it like ceremonial guards. I stood there with a rake in my hand, watching decades of smart water planning get buried under decorative stones. A few neighbors passed by, offering half-hearted shrugs or sympathetic glances. No one said a word to Karen. She had them all wrapped around her HOA-issued finger. I tried to reason with her one last time. "Karen," I said, "this isn't about looks. That ditch prevents both our homes from flooding. It's a shared runoff path. Block it and the water won't just stop. It'll go sideways. Downhill. You do know your basement is lower than my patio, right?" She waved me off. "My foundation is fine. It's sealed. Besides, the HOA voted. It's done." Then she handed me a citation. Unauthorized soil disruption. $25. I walked back to my porch and looked at the sky. Thick clouds had begun to gather, heavy with promise. July in our region meant one thing: flash floods. They rolled in with heat and rage, dumped their weight in minutes, then vanished. I'd seen the forecast. A storm system was sitting just west of us, pulsing on the radar like a heartbeat. I could already smell the moisture in the air. I considered digging the ditch back open myself, but I knew better. Karen had set up cameras. Tampering with her new gravel garden would get me fined again, or worse. I took a different approach. I documented everything. Photos, time-stamped, videos of the before and after water flow. Then I sat back and waited. I didn't need to fight her. Nature was going to do it for me. That night, the storm hit. The rain didn't just fall. It attacked. Sheets of water pounded rooftops. Thunder cracked like bones snapping in the sky. I stepped out to the porch, dry under the awning, watching the water collect in my yard, and back up like a rising tide. My ditch, blocked and decorated, sat useless. The water hesitated, then crept sideways, found a slope, and followed gravity like a bloodhound on a scent, right toward Karen's backyard. Her property, always pristine, now looked like a melting wedding cake. Lawn ornaments floated. Patio furniture tilted. And then, the real show began. Her basement windows fogged up from the inside. The water was getting in. Lights flickered. Somewhere, I heard the unmistakable sound of a shop vac screaming into the void. Then silence. The next morning, I was sipping black coffee when I saw her charging across the street. Hair frizzed, pajama pants soaked halfway up the legs, shoes squelching like fresh sponges. She held up a paper that flapped in the wind, dripping. I recognized it immediately. An HOA violation slip. For me. She stormed up my porch and yelled, "This is your fault, you knew this would happen." I calmly stood, walked into my garage, and returned holding a printed city easement map and a stack of photos. I handed them to her one by one, like a magician revealing cards. Here's the ditch before. Here's the construction. Here's the water last night. She looked at them, jaw tight, and then her eye twitched. A neighbor peeked from their blinds. Another came out with a rake and pretended to do yard work just to listen in. Karen's voice dropped into a whisper. "You planned this, didn't you?" I shrugged. "You blocked a drainage ditch in a floodplain. I'm just letting physics do the talking." Then I added, "By the way, you might want to check with your insurance company. Floods from landscaping negligence usually aren't covered." She stared at me for a long moment, lips trembling with either fury or the realization of impending financial doom. Then she stomped back through puddles toward her soggy castle. I watched her go, the queen of gravel, the empress of consequence. A frog leapt from the waterlogged grass and landed in her flower bed. It croaked. I swear it sounded like laughter. And that's how it all began. One blocked ditch. One storm. And one HOA president who thought she could outvote gravity. The aftermath of the flood left the neighborhood in a strange, tense quiet. People were still talking, but no one was talking directly to Karen. Her once manicured backyard looked like a scene from a disaster documentary. Mud streaks trailed up her back porch, flower beds were ripped open by runoff, and one of her precious white patio chairs was still lodged against the neighbor's fence like a stranded ship. Karen, however, was determined not to be defeated. She showed up at the next HOA board meeting with a printed slideshow, blaming her basement flood on what she called unauthorized modifications to neighborhood drainage patterns. The implication, of course, was that I had somehow rerouted water away from my property and into hers as an act of sabotage. She used words like malicious hydrological interference and gross negligence, and even tried to get me banned from board meetings for threatening community safety. I sat quietly at the back of the room, arms crossed, watching the projection of her flooded basement plastered on the whiteboard while she narrated dramatically as if auditioning for a crime show. A few board members looked uncomfortable. One asked, "Didn't she authorize the gravel landscaping over the drainage ditch?" Karen replied that she did, but insisted it was purely cosmetic. Another member pointed out that the concrete barrier installed during her so-called beautification effort was now blocking a public utility easement. Karen waved it off as a necessary upgrade. I didn't speak once during the entire session. I didn't have to. I already had a folder prepared for what would come next. The following day, I went down to City Hall and met with a zoning officer named Mark, who had the kind of calm patience only someone who deals with irate residents all day could possess. I showed him the original property lines, the city-issued easement diagrams, and a set of photographs dated before and after the blockages were installed. Mark raised an eyebrow at the images of gravel stuffed over a clearly defined ditch. He asked if anyone had filed for construction permits through the HOA. I told him not only had they not, but they had sent me a fine for objecting. That did the trick. Mark scribbled something in a notebook, nodded slowly, and said he'd take a look himself. 3 days later, 2 city inspectors with clipboards and a wheel measure showed up on my street. They spent most of the morning surveying the easement behind my property, taking pictures, poking at the gravel with steel rods, and checking elevation drop. I watched from my porch. Karen stood in her driveway, arms folded, glaring. One of the inspectors knocked on her door and asked politely if they could examine her side of the property. She said not without a warrant and slammed the door in their face. The next morning, the HOA received a citation for blocking a regulated water runoff channel, with a city-mandated order to restore it to functional condition within 30 days or face penalties. Karen posted a furious rant on the HOA newsletter's digital board accusing the city of targeting her because of neighborhood politics. She even suggested I had bribed the inspectors, a claim so ridiculous even her most loyal allies quietly backed away. But I wasn't satisfied with just getting the ditch back. I wanted to understand how Karen had gotten this far unchecked. So I started digging through old HOA documents, meeting notes, board member emails that had been made public by request, and archived newsletters. It didn't take long to find the pattern. Karen had a strategy. She bullied, manipulated, or confused people with her jargon until they either gave in or stopped resisting. Most of her motions passed because no one showed up to vote. When someone did object, she buried them in paperwork or passive-aggressive fines until they either caved or sold their house. Her power wasn't rooted in legality. It was rooted in exhaustion. I remembered when she first moved in 5 years ago. She introduced herself with a pie and a clipboard. Said she wanted to bring order and vision to the neighborhood. Everyone thought she was just eager. She started organizing community yard sales, then holiday decorations, then she declared the front lawns needed unified mulch colors. That was the first sign. Next came uniform mailboxes, then noise ordinances for lawnmowers. But her ultimate dream was total aesthetic control, and the ditch, with its messy nature and unlandscaped edges, had become a personal affront to her vision. Then came an unexpected twist. A neighbor I barely knew named Denise, who lived 2 doors down from Karen, knocked on my door one evening with a flash drive. She was nervous, eyes darting around like she thought Karen had cameras on every tree. I let her in. Once inside, she confessed she used to be part of the HOA's internal correspondence list and had saved copies of certain communications before Karen removed her. On the drive were emails that changed everything. Karen had known for years that her basement sat in a natural flood basin. In fact, before she even bought the home, the realtor had disclosed previous water issues. One of the emails was Karen demanding the HOA alter property reports to downplay flood risks so she could get better insurance rates. Another was her proposing the ditch removal as a way to boost her backyard's resale value. That was the smoking gun. I thanked Denise and promised not to drag her into anything. I didn't need her name. I had the evidence. I printed the emails and tucked them into a binder with everything else. The trap was nearly set. I had one more call to make. I dialed my friend Alan, a retired civil engineer who now taught part-time at the local college. I asked him to draft a short report confirming the function of the ditch, the implications of its blockage, and a summary of runoff physics specific to our elevation grid. He laughed when I told him the story and had the document to me in 2 days, complete with diagrams and soil data. The day before the 30-day deadline expired, Karen sent out an HOA-wide message claiming that the city's citation had been appealed and that no one was to interfere with the gravel area until legal matters were resolved. The email was riddled with vague threats and grandstanding language. I responded by attaching the engineer's report, the city's orders, and a single line typed in plain font. Any further delay is obstruction of public infrastructure and will be documented accordingly. The next morning, I woke to the sound of shovels scraping. A professional landscaping crew hired by the HOA had shown up to begin removing the gravel and concrete Karen once declared a community masterpiece. Karen wasn't outside. Her car wasn't in the driveway. But her curtains were fluttering, just slightly, from an upstairs window. I stood near the workers as they dug, chatting with the supervisor. He laughed when I told him about the flood. Said he'd seen dozens of neighborhoods where someone tried to decorate over functionality. Said gravity doesn't care about politics. As they uncovered more of the original ditch, water still lingering from a smaller storm 2 nights earlier began to flow again, naturally, peacefully. It was like watching a blocked artery open up. But I wasn't finished yet. The ditch was clear. The city was satisfied. But the real storm was just beginning. Because once the rest of the neighborhood found out what Karen had known about her basement, and the way she'd put everyone else at risk just to cover it up, they wouldn't be so afraid of her anymore. They'd be angry. And an angry neighborhood was something even Karen couldn't micromanage. The reckoning was on its way. All I had to do now was sit back and let the truth rain down. The days leading up to the next storm carried a strange sense of anticipation, like the air before a stage play starts, except in this case, the cast didn't know they were about to walk into their own downfall. Karen may have remained inside her house most of the time, but her presence lingered over the neighborhood like a low-pressure system. People whispered more freely now. Some had begun knocking on my door, not just to talk about the ditch, but to vent about years of petty citations, forced HOA projects, and fines they paid simply to avoid Karen's wrath. Her grip on the community had weakened, and though she still wielded her clipboard and newsletter, the fear was beginning to unravel. But it wasn't enough for Karen to retreat quietly. She had to have the last word. It started with a suspicious delivery. A few days after the landscaping crew had restored the drainage ditch to its original state, a flatbed truck showed up with a concrete structure labeled Decorative Water Feature Base. The workers seemed confused when they dropped it off in Karen's driveway. It looked more like a low retaining wall or a reinforced basin. That afternoon, I saw Karen in her backyard with 2 young men in matching shirts, her nephews, from what I gathered. They began installing the structure near the ditch, except instead of working around the flow, they were rerouting it with makeshift stone channels. I watched silently from my porch. The water would now back up behind her wall, creating a shallow pool. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. She was building a dam. To anyone else, it probably looked like harmless garden decor, but I could read her intent like a blueprint. The new layout would slow the drainage long enough to keep her own yard dry during light storms, while sending any overflow in the opposite direction, toward mine. It was petty, illegal, and impressively bold. But she didn't know I'd already filed the city report, and the runoff was being monitored. The moment water pooled where it wasn't supposed to, she'd be caught. And rain was coming. The forecast warned of a heavy system arriving by Friday night. I made my usual preparations, clearing debris, checking the gutter spouts, reinforcing the edges of the ditch with stone, but I added one new item. A waterproof wildlife camera, mounted discreetly in a tree near the edge of my property, pointed straight at the new barrier Karen had built. It recorded on motion and streamed directly to a cloud folder. Evidence was my shield now. I didn't need confrontation. I just needed patience. Friday evening arrived with a soft wind and a humid hush. The neighborhood was quiet. People had retreated indoors, securing loose chairs and garden tools. The sky turned that familiar green-gray tint, warning of what was about to come. Thunder rumbled far off like a slow drumbeat. The first drops fell just after 8. By 8:30, the rain was pounding hard enough to rattle windows. I sat in my garage with the door open, sipping tea, watching the water rise. The ditch performed beautifully on my side. The flow picked up speed, racing along the cleared channel. But just before the water exited toward Karen's lot, it hit the new stone barrier she'd constructed. The water slowed, swirled, and began to back up. The system choked. The moment came fast. 1 minute it was contained, and the next, it spilled over the edge and surged sideways. But this time, the redirection worked against her. Instead of pushing water into my yard as she'd hoped, the sheer volume overwhelmed her new channel, and it collapsed. Water poured down the slope, straight toward her patio door. The glass trembled under the pressure. Then it gave. At precisely 9:17 p.m., Karen's basement took its second bath of the summer. The water rushed in through the broken pane like a waterfall in reverse. Furniture floated again. Boxes dissolved. An extension cord popped with sparks and fizzed out in the water. My camera caught everything. The collapse, the flood, and even the frantic figure of Karen appearing at the glass just moments before the surge. By morning, the damage was done. The rain had passed, leaving behind a misty, steaming silence. Karen's backyard was a ruin. Her once white gravel walkway was buried under sludge. The decorative basin had cracked. Her back porch sagged slightly, warped from water pressure. I walked over to the edge of my yard, just enough to see without being intrusive. She saw me. We locked eyes for a long second, neither of us saying a word. Then she disappeared inside again. But the silence didn't last. Later that day, the city inspector returned, this time with someone from the Department of Environmental Services. They carried a printed photo from my camera feed. The concrete structure Karen installed had blocked a stormwater management path, and that was a serious offense. Worse, when they tried to inspect her property, she again refused them entry, citing privacy and homeowner rights. That didn't sit well. The city issued a formal warning: comply or face civil penalties and an environmental damage citation. Karen didn't come to the next HOA meeting. Instead, she submitted a statement through another board member claiming she was recovering from a personal crisis and needed time away from her responsibilities. But the room was different now. The air had changed. People weren't timid anymore. Stories poured out from other residents: how Karen fined someone for painting their fence the wrong shade of taupe, how she rewrote guidelines to exclude garden gnomes after a neighbor bought a 3-foot-tall frog statue, how she repeatedly silenced anyone who opposed her during meetings with technicalities and threat. One by one, her allies shrank away. When the treasurer read the financial report and revealed Karen had used discretionary funds for the beautification project, without full board approval, there were actual gasps. I sat in the back again, just like before, only this time I wasn't the outsider. I was the catalyst. When the meeting ended, 3 neighbors stopped to shake my hand. One even laughed and said, "Never thought I'd thank a ditch." I smiled but didn't say much. The truth didn't need embellishment anymore. The story was writing itself now. Karen still hadn't taken responsibility, but the weight of her choices was now public record. And word had begun to spread beyond the neighborhood. A local blogger who specialized in HOA horror stories had picked up the story, probably from one of the neighbors, and was now asking to interview me. I declined, but the blogger published anyway, using aerial shots and quoting the HOA's own newsletters. The headline was blunt: "Woman floods own home twice, blames ditch." The comments section was merciless. Despite everything, part of me still wondered if Karen would double down again. She had the stubbornness of a mule tied to a throne. But something had changed. Her silence had length. It stretched for days. Her porch lights didn't come on at night. The HOA newsletter didn't go out that month. No more threats. No more fines. Just quiet. The kind that comes after a thunderclap, when the damage has been done and nothing else can be said to justify it. I spent a few evenings walking the ditch, checking for debris, reinforcing the sides with new stone. A few neighbors joined me one afternoon and asked what they could do to help. One brought a rake. Another offered to plant low shrubs to prevent erosion. It wasn't just about the ditch anymore. It was about taking back what had been quietly stolen from everyone for years: peace, fairness, and the right to not live under the weight of one person's ego disguised as order. The ditch had done its job twice now. But more than that, it had revealed the truth. Karen didn't understand the power of simple things. She thought she could control nature like she controlled people, with rules and threats and a little landscaping. But water doesn't obey newsletters. It doesn't care about uniform gravel or personal vendettas. It flows where it needs to go. And sometimes that's right through the heart of hypocrisy. The silence surrounding Karen's house didn't just linger, it began to grow roots. The once pristine hedges bordering her property were starting to look overgrown. The HOA newsletters had stopped completely. The American flag she always displayed on her porch hung crooked for nearly a week before someone else straightened it. And most telling of all, her porch light, always on, always watching, stayed off for 11 straight nights. It was like watching a monarch voluntarily abandon her throne, only the crown she left behind was cracked and waterlogged. But even in her absence, the consequences she had set in motion were still unfolding, and the neighborhood, now fully awake, wasn't about to let it go unanswered. Word of Karen's antics had spread well beyond our small HOA circle. The local blogger's article was picked up by a small independent news site, and from there it went regional. Someone even posted the story on a viral community Facebook page titled HOA Madness. The comments poured in. People shared their own horror stories of overreaching board presidents, unjust fines, and decorative tyranny. Karen's name wasn't included directly in the articles, but anyone who lived within 10 blocks knew exactly who it was. She had become a symbol of the very kind of authoritarian pettiness that made people dread homeowner associations in the first place. The city, meanwhile, was moving ahead with its investigation. The Department of Environmental Services had confirmed that Karen's unauthorized water feature had contributed to the second flood, and because it directly impacted regulated runoff flow, she was now liable not just for code violations but potential environmental damage fines. When the inspector returned with a formal report in hand, I happened to be walking my dog. He recognized me immediately and gave a slow shake of his head, the kind that said he'd seen it all but still couldn't believe it. He told me the fine would be hefty. When I asked what would happen if she refused to pay, he simply said, "Liens have a funny way of finding their way onto property records." Neighbors were buzzing with cautious hope. Some began drafting a petition to recall Karen from the HOA presidency officially, even though she hadn't shown up to a meeting in weeks. Others went door to door, asking for stories and examples of unfair fines and abuses of power. It wasn't revenge. It was revelation. People weren't just angry about the ditch anymore, they were revisiting every painful encounter they'd had with Karen's reign. One couple shared how she fined them for having a dog that barked during delivery hours, even though their doorbell camera showed Karen herself provoking it by ringing repeatedly. Another neighbor, a single mom, had been issued 3 citations in 1 month for failing to maintain yard symmetry while recovering from surgery. These weren't just petty. They were cruel. Eventually, the inevitable happened. A formal HOA emergency meeting was called, this time by the vice president and 2 other board members, citing dereliction of duty and misconduct. It was to be held in the community center rather than the usual backyard patio of whoever Karen approved that month. The turnout was staggering. People who hadn't been to an HOA meeting in years, if ever, showed up and filled every plastic chair in the room. Some stood in the back, arms folded, quiet but charged. The energy was thick with anticipation. I arrived early and sat near the front, this time not alone. A few of the neighbors who once feared speaking up now sat beside me, offering firm nods of solidarity. The vice president, a mild-mannered retired librarian named Glenn, opened the meeting with a shaky voice and a piece of paper that trembled slightly in his hand. But as he read through the list of infractions, unauthorized use of HOA funds, unapproved construction over public drainage, failure to respond to city citations, and deliberate misinformation shared through newsletters, his voice grew stronger. By the time he called for a vote of no confidence, you could hear a pin drop. Hands went up, row after row. Even the few people who once backed Karen kept their arms folded tight across their chests, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. The vote was unanimous. Karen was removed as HOA president effective immediately. She didn't attend the meeting. A letter was sent to her formally notifying her of the board's decision and requesting she return all HOA materials and relinquish any account access. No one expected her to comply, but that didn't matter anymore. The neighborhood had shifted. The power she held through intimidation, paperwork, and performative authority had crumbled. In its place was something far more resilient: unity. In the days that followed, the new acting board began auditing HOA finances and policies. A few of us volunteered to help comb through old documentation. What we found wasn't just bad, it was embarrassing. There were expense reports for decorations that never appeared, supply purchases at triple market cost, and even 2 months of landscape consultation, fees paid to a company registered under Karen's cousin's name. The HOA was bleeding from inside, all dressed up in pretty gravel and well-pruned bushes. One neighbor described it as discovering mold under wallpaper. Beautiful on the surface, rotten at the core. To begin repairing trust, the board decided to host a public Q&A in the community center. No formal rules, no scripts, just a space where anyone could speak freely about what they wanted from their neighborhood. It was awkward at first. People fidgeted. Some stumbled over their words. But then a woman named Clara stood up and simply said, "I just want to feel like I belong here again." That broke the ice. Soon others shared stories, frustrations, and even a few jokes about the infamous ditch. Someone suggested naming it Karen's Canal. The room burst out laughing. But perhaps the most significant moment came when Glenn, the new acting president, proposed an idea. He suggested turning the drainage area behind my property into a small community-managed green buffer zone, complete with native plants, proper signage about its runoff function, and a few benches for good measure. It would remain functional but become a quiet symbol of what the neighborhood had learned. I nodded, both honored and amused. I said I'd be happy to help maintain it, but only if we never install any fountains. Behind the laughter, there was real progress. People were talking to each other again. Yard work became less about competition and more about cooperation. Kids played outside without parents glancing nervously toward Karen's house. And that house, now a little faded, still for sale with a visible disclosure notice about its flooding history, stood quiet and alone, the last monument to a rule that had long overstayed its welcome. I spent more time in my backyard, walking the ditch after each rainfall. The water flowed cleanly now, carving its natural path with quiet determination. Occasionally, I'd find small sticks or leaves caught at the edges, and I'd remove them carefully, not because I had to but because it felt right. Nature had done its part. The community had done theirs. And for the first time in years, I felt like the ground beneath us was finally solid. One evening, just after sunset, I noticed a small package on my porch. No note. No label. Inside was a ceramic frog, green, wide-eyed, and holding a tiny mailbox. I laughed for a solid minute. Whether it was from Clara, Glenn, or one of the others, I didn't know. But it didn't matter. It was a thank you, a joke, and a quiet celebration all in one. And so, the story of a simple drainage ditch that unseated a tyrant found its way to closure. The water had risen twice. It had tested our patience, our systems, and our willingness to stand up. But in the end, it had also washed something away, the fear that one person's power was stronger than the truth. All that was left now was to keep things clear, let the water flow, and make sure the next storm had no place to hide. The final storm of the season came on a Tuesday afternoon, without much warning. The forecasts had mentioned possible showers, maybe a thunderclap or two, but by 4 o'clock the sky was blackened and groaning like a tired beast awakening. Winds lashed the trees, and the air felt thick enough to chew. I stood in my kitchen watching the rain begin to hammer the windows and listening to the steady roar of water racing through the newly restored ditch. But this time, there was no tension in my chest, no wondering whether the flood would turn toward me or toward someone else. This time, I knew exactly where it would go, and I knew the system we'd rebuilt would handle it. The ditch had become more than a channel for water. It had become a line drawn in the soil, one that separated the old rain from the new chapter we were finally building together. The storm lasted less than an hour, but the damage was enough to turn the road into a mirror of muddy reflections and scatter loose branches like forgotten game pieces. Yet despite the mess, something remarkable happened. No flooding. Not in my yard. Not in my basement. Not even, surprisingly, in Karen's house. The repairs, both official and unofficial, had worked. The restored water flow had held its course. And for the first time in months, I saw something unexpected when I glanced at Karen's property. She was standing on her back porch in a raincoat, staring at the water moving calmly along the ditch. There was no anger on her face, no clipboard, no performative shock. Just silence. And maybe, just maybe, a flicker of understanding. The house was still for sale, the sign out front slightly askew from the wind, but something had shifted. She hadn't left. Not yet. Rumors had floated around that she was having trouble finding a buyer because of the now public flood disclosures. The neighborhood had changed too much for her to keep up the old routine, and perhaps deep down, she knew it. Still, she didn't speak to anyone. Not even a wave. Just a quiet presence now, a shadow rather than a storm. Meanwhile, the rest of us kept moving forward. The Community Green Zone project officially kicked off the following week. A few dozen neighbors gathered near the ditch with gloves, rakes, mulch bags, and even some donated wildflowers from a local nursery. I brought iced tea and a folding table. Glenn brought his speaker and played soft jazz while we worked. Kids ran around with watering cans and chased butterflies. There was laughter, there was sweat, and most importantly, there was unity. It had been a long time since anyone had come together for something that didn't involve compliance or fines. One of the most surprising volunteers was Denise, the neighbor who had given me the flash drive months earlier. She hadn't spoken much since then, keeping to herself mostly, but that morning she showed up with a small plaque she'd ordered online. It was a simple metal sign, brushed bronze, with words etched neatly into the center. Community Resilience Project, reclaimed by neighbors, restored by nature. We placed it on a small post at the center of the ditch bank. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't formal. But it meant something to all of us. After the planting wrapped up, someone suggested we hold a casual ceremony to mark the transformation of what used to be considered an eyesore. It wasn't an official event. No permits, no decorations. Just a few of us standing around sharing stories. Glenn gave a short speech thanking everyone for showing up not just to clean up but to repair something that had been broken far longer than anyone admitted. He didn't name Karen. He didn't need to. The message was clear. Power belonged to the people who showed up, not the ones who shouted loudest. As the weeks passed, small changes became permanent fixtures. The HOA began operating with transparency. Monthly financial reports were posted online. Community votes actually meant something now. People started showing up to meetings not out of fear, but curiosity and even enthusiasm. One of the younger couples proposed a monthly garden swap. Someone else suggested a fall block party. All things Karen would have sneered at as frivolous distractions from her vision of order. But now, with her authority removed and her influence dissolved, the neighborhood finally had room to breathe. A few neighbors even began repairing their strained friendship. I overheard one man apologizing to another for ignoring his complaints about a noise citation years ago, saying he'd been too afraid of getting fined himself. That kind of honesty spread like a bomb. People forgave each other. They shared their experiences, not to dwell in the past, but to understand how far they'd let things slip without realizing. The truth was, we'd all been complicit in our own way, through silence, through hesitation, through convenience. But no more. As for me, I kept tending the ditch. It became something of a ritual. Every few days I'd walk the length of it, remove branches, check for erosion, and adjust the flow stones if needed. A few times, kids followed me, asking questions about water flow and why the ditch was so important. I explained it the way my father once explained rivers to me. It's not just about where water goes. It's about how you let it move, how you give it space to do its work without trying to force it into something it's not. One boy called me the ditch whisperer, and I laughed so hard I nearly dropped my gloves. Eventually, the for sale sign at Karen's house came down. No announcement, no moving truck, just a clean lawn and drawn curtains. Rumor had it she pulled the listing. Whether she planned to stay or was simply regrouping, no one knew. But it didn't matter anymore. Her presence didn't control anything now. The power she once held had been absorbed back into the roots of the community she tried to dominate. She was just another homeowner now. One who, like the rest of us, would have to follow the same rules she once twisted to her favor. And so the summer turned to fall. The leaves changed color, the air thinned, and the rains grew softer. The ditch, now framed with goldenrod and soft ferns, flowed peacefully through our neighborhood. It had seen war. It had seen betrayal, manipulation, and petty control. But now it carried something else entirely. A kind of redemption. A lesson. Looking back, it still astonishes me that all of this came from a single bad decision, a decorative gravel dump over a ditch no one thought twice about until it was gone. It wasn't the storm that destroyed Karen's authority. It was her belief that she could override the simple, immutable truths of how things work. Water will always find its way. People will always resist tyranny when given a chance. And nature, whether in soil, in spirit, or in the collective conscience, will reclaim what was stolen from it, given time. The ditch didn't just drain water. It drained fear. It flushed out the lies and the manipulation. It carried away the weight we'd all been carrying for far too long. And as I stood there one last time before winter, watching the shallow current glisten in the orange glow of dusk, I knew that this neighborhood would never go back to what it was. It didn't need to. It had become something better. All thanks to one forgotten ditch. And the truth it refused to bury.